Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Women in Planning's takeover of the Voice of Authority. My name is Charlotte Morphet, and I'm a Principal Policy Planner at the London Borough of Waltham Forest. But I'm also the co-founder and national co-chair of Women in Planning. Women in Planning is a network that seeks to promote equality, diversity, and inclusion within the planning profession. We really believe that you can't be what you can't see. Our network provides a platform for women to share their professional expertise, and that's why we are proud to be partnering with the Voice of Authority on this webinar and delighted to bring you four incredible speakers from the world of local authority planning. So today's session is going to be focused on the government's white paper, Planning for the Future, and what it means for local authorities. However, the white paper, as I'm sure you're aware, is jam-packed full of proposals, and we just won't be able to do it justice in 1 hour. So don't worry, the Voice of Authority has got you covered, and there's another amazing session that you can book for this Thursday at 11 AM. And if you haven't booked, there's still time too. It's quite simple. Go to www.thevoiceofauthority.co.uk and secure your place. But so to move on to the event today, how are councils responding to planning for the future? The government has said that the aim of the white paper is to overhaul an outdated planning system and replace it with one that speeds up the delivery of beautiful homes whilst protecting and valuing green spaces. But do local authorities think these proposed reforms will deliver beautiful homes faster or slow down the system? The proposals in the white paper would see the country divided into 3 zones: renewal, growth and protect. For each zone, there's a different way you can get planning consent. In a growth zone, it could be through permission in principle via the local plan. For renewal areas, it could be consent obtained via a neighbourhood development order. Or if you wanted to build in a protect zone, well, you just go through the same route as you do now, submit a planning application. In this new system, local plans will be expected to be delivered in 30 months unless you have a newly adopted local plan, which means you get a bit of extra time with 42 months. These local plans are expected to be rules-based and not policy-based, and focused on allocating land. There will no longer be a test of soundness. It will be replaced by a test of sustainable development. There will no longer be duty to cooperate to deal with strategic planning matters, but as most of us will probably comment, the white paper is silent on strategic planning, and we're not sure what will replace this. Housing need will be determined at a national level, but arguments over 5-year land supply are supposedly ceased to exist, as this is replaced with a slimmed down housing delivery test. Section 106 and SIL are to be scrapped and replaced with a flat rate nationally set infrastructure levy, where affordable housing can be secured on site in kind. So that's a very high level summary, and I'm sure I've missed some of the points that our panelists might cover and what you might be thinking about in the audience. But let's see what our panelists think. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Heather Cheesbrough, Director of Planning and Strategic Transport at the London Borough of Croydon, Neeru Kareer, Assistant Service Director for Planning and Building Control at Barnet Council, Lucy Taylor, Director of Regeneration and Planning at Ealing Council, and Sara Whelan, Group Manager for Development Management and Planning at Dacorum Borough Council. I'm confident this is going to be a lively and interesting discussion. Please do use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens to submit your questions and to vote for questions that you would like me to put to the panelists later. But for now, let's get some insight. I'm going to kick off today's session with a question to each panelist, and then I will come back to each of them to ask for a summary before opening up to the floor for your questions. So without further ado, I'm going to start with Neeru. Neeru, thanks for joining us. Given your experience of delivering local plans and being in charge of planning policy teams, how do you think timelines at the moment are going to be affected by the proposed reforms in the white paper? Do you see councils halting or still carrying on?
Morning, thanks Charlotte. It's a really interesting question, a really timely question that will be on the minds of many strategic planning teams across the country. I think we go back to pillar 1 of the white paper, which is planning for development, and here we see that it's focusing on local plans, and I think that in my reading is at the very core of what the white paper's primary proposals are about. And I think it's, on the one hand, it's really positive to see the government endorse a continued commitment to a plan-led system. But I think for some of us, it's also, it also strikes a certain contradiction, with many of us on the public-facing side of planning, seeing this at odds with wider reforms that MHCLG have been putting forward and dropping over the last couple of months, with unleashing less control, with the greater and widening of PDR, and of course the new use classes order. I mean, what the white paper is doing is it's basically proposing fundamental changes to both the content and process of plan development. And I don't think any of my peers would disagree with me on this call, that the length of time it takes to work through the existing plan making system is laborious. And it's become a heavy process that weighs on the shoulders of many reduced resources in spatial planning policy teams. The facts speak for themselves, and the white paper sets this out in terms of it taking, on average, authorities 7 years to get plans to adoption. So I think proposals to reduce this to just 2.5 years is ambitious, but certainly welcome. I think the timescales and burdens within the current system, they're just not good enough. And they're certainly not the responsive system that planners aspire to work within. And nor do these timeframes provide a constructive framework for development and infrastructure to come forward. I think the implied new process of nationally binding housing targets will, I imagine, see many local planning authorities move towards reviewing their plans and moving swiftly within the current system. Not least also because that will then also buy themselves the additional 42 months to consider any review under the transitional arrangements, and that seems perfectly sensible. I think it's going to be interesting to see also how local authorities can be resourced, but also how the planning inspectorate will be resourced to move these plans on swiftly. And there are also processes within local democratic governance that may need to change to allow plans to actually advance, particularly when you think about how we actually advance plans currently and how transparent we remain within a locally democratic process to get plans through to adoption now, with the added consideration of, upon adoption, will be basically permitting outline, planning consent, and permission in principle, as you say. And I think that very much there is a job for a new chief planner, so to speak, to kind of wrestle with how we do that. I think it's not quite the radical zoning planning reform that was hyped at the beginning. And we are seeing the white paper take us back to what some of us will remember in our careers, more of a map-based approach to land use and spatial planning, which I think has its advantages. And I'm personally excited to see a new world of shortened and concise plans, and quite frankly, to be rid of some of the torturous sort of evidence base and reams of evidence base that we continually tie ourselves in knots about. So, I look forward to not having to keep on top of updated evidence to support the plan making process. But of course, it's not simple, and planning by its nature is very complex. So moving away from reams of evidence is one thing, but how we actually ensure that we've got properly consulted on plans, properly transparent processes is something that I think the transformation in digital activity will be something that could be a game changer. And I do think that could actually help move plan making, right into the 21st century and doing something that is much more streamlined and swifter. So I think, in terms of answering sort of those questions, I think many are in the process of being either at a proposed submission stage or gearing up for further consultation. And my advice would be, do not stop the process, keep it moving under the current system. There's time for legislation to break in, and watch this space.
Thank you, Neeru. I tend to agree. Yeah, especially if you get that extra 12 months as well. So next up we have Lucy. So Lucy, thanks for joining us as well. What effect would the white paper proposals have on your strategy for investment, regeneration and growth? And how do you think the new thinking on Section 106 will help or hinder placemaking? You know, Section 106 isn't just for collecting affordable housing, as the white paper seems to insinuate, but it can be used for a range of other things that help local authorities shape places. So yeah, be interested to get your thoughts on that.
Thanks, Charlotte. Good morning, everyone. Yeah, well, I suppose overall, in terms of the white paper, I welcome the idea of let's make the planning system a bit more simple to speed things up. And so I think the kind of principle of where the government wants to go is very welcome, but the paper that they've released so far is short on detail on how that might actually happen and how we can then make that happen. So I think one of my biggest concerns for a borough like mine in Ealing is we've got a really big programme of growth, renewal and regeneration, and this is quite frankly a bit of a distraction. So sort of what does that mean for us? We were in the middle of launching a local plan and starting that off, and now we're having to think, well how does this sit alongside what we're needing to do through our own new local plan? And clearly we will plough on, because who knows where this white paper will go. But I think so I think I am concerned about the time scale and the delay that the thinking in this new white paper may bring. So that's one of the things I'm concerned about. I think another thing is that it particularly, and I'm sure it's the same in all big cities, the kind of idea that you can zone things into one of those three categories is just a huge oversimplification. And I can see ourselves getting caught up in lots of knots of, is this a growth area? Is this a renewal area? We all know there are bits, you know, particularly in some of our town centres, which are really, really well connected with public transport, that we want to see and have big plans for growth and renewal. However, there will be parts of those town centres that we need to protect. And I've just not really got a sense of how does that work in this new zoning kind of approach, and will we really be able to protect the best bits of some of our existing built form at the same time as encouraging the big growth that's needed? And I'm trying to think of places in Ealing like Southall, where we're talking about 15,000 new homes, and North Acton, but there are still bits within that where there are existing communities, and we will want to protect things there for those communities. So I think this oversimplification, or this desire for simplification, has, you know, I can't quite see how that might actually play out in practice and enable the growth that we want to see. So I'm kind of wanting to look at that a bit more. Another kind of angle in terms of that joining up is, you know, my responsibility is not just for planning, but for regeneration, economic development. And I think in Ealing, we've really successfully used planning as a tool to enable all of that. And I suppose that's my point about this oversimplification, is how do we carry on that approach if we've got to be so stark in designating areas. Turning to the infrastructure levy section 106 thing, well, it's a bit frustrating. We're all just getting our heads around community infrastructure levy, and now they're talking about something else, and we were all trying to work out how section 106 worked within that. Again, I welcome the idea of simplicity, because how much time do we all spend on negotiations on section 106? So the idea in principle of that simplicity is really welcome. But I am again concerned that the devil's in the detail. You know, there's nothing in this white paper to say how are we going to deal with the complex issue around viability. You know, I think it is right to say let's try and capture that land value uplift. Now, I get incredibly frustrated at the developers who get planning consent and then flip it on, and all they're doing is taking the profit. I think it's absolutely right that the public sector needs to take that. But again, there's no detail about how that will happen, and if we can get over the dance around the viability and the dark arts of appraisals, then I'd really welcome that. But I'm looking forward to seeing what that happens. I think the other thing is also I do have concerns about how across the nationally a nationally driven approach around this, what that means for the delivery of affordable housing, particularly in somewhere like London where we so desperately need it, and where many of us are choosing to create that as a priority. What will that mean through this? And you're right, we use Section 106 to help deliver a whole variety of different things that are needed. And I think I at the moment, I like the flexibility that the council has in deciding what our priorities are. And I think it will be the idea that might then be lost. I think we need to really focus on and make sure that doesn't happen. So overall, welcome the principle and the desire for simplicity, but I'm looking forward to seeing how the detail pans out, and I do have some real concerns. Thank you.
Thank you. There was some really interesting points there, especially around the oversimplifications of zones, and just thinking how many high streets in London are conservation areas as well, and what does that quite mean? Can they go in renewal? I'm not quite sure from the reforms. No, that's very, very interesting. So up next, Heather, thank you again for joining us. Heather, really coming to you to talk about resource and skills, and what you think the proposals in the white paper mean for a borough like Croydon and other local authorities.
Thank you, Charlotte. I think I'm very, very concerned about what the white paper says, frankly. I mean, I should really dress up and say, I welcome this, I welcome that, but frankly, no. I think that it is a thinly veiled grab at centralising the planning system and removing local democracy. And in response to your question about what it will do in terms of resources and timescales, it is going to be, as Lucy said, a distraction, but actually more than that, I think it is going to really grind things to a halt. Because as the Prime Minister sets out in his forward, he wants to tear up the planning system. Now, yes, the planning system can be slow, but it can also deliver some extremely fast consents. And I think it's all very well sitting there concentrating on the negative aspects. There's a lot of really, really good planning being done out there. A lot of really good regeneration, a really lot of good growth. So let's not throw away all the good work that has been done by the planning system since 1947. And let's not forget that we have a fantastic urban form and built environment that has been built over thousands of years. And to go around comparing the UK to Australia and the United States is just so naive. It's unbelievable. So I have got huge concerns about it in terms of whether it's going to speed things up. No, I don't think it is, because in terms of skills and resources, in Croydon, we are quite lucky that we have a really good set of placemaking officers. I've got quite a decent spatial planning team, and I've got some fantastic staff, hugely skilled, highly skilled staff. And I'm very proud that they want to work in Croydon when they could get an awful lot more money working in the private sector. And that's one of the key issues, is that we have, as I'm sure colleagues today will know, we've been fighting over the small pool of staff who work in local government, and we have to fight against each other, and we also have to fight against the private sector. So that's tough, and the lack of resources full stop into local government and planning departments has been a problem for many, many years. And we all know that planning applications, householders and smaller applications, they don't wash their face in terms of the fee we get. We have to offset that through major applications and try and bring in pre-application fees and PPA fees to offset all our other planning work, like local plan making and enforcement as well. So you have to have a decent resourced planning system, and at the moment we don't. I do welcome the bits that talk about putting the cost of planning onto developers. However, the government has undermined that through things like PDR over the years. So you're putting in place lots of permitted development with nowhere near any sort of fee. And And you still got to write local plans, and you still have to go and investigate complaints from residents who are unhappy about enforcement that's happened on PDR. And then you say, well, it's permitted development. You still got to spend money on it. So there needs to be a proper appraisal of how do you properly resource planning departments and proper fees. And we know that the fee on a planning application is nothing in comparison to the overall cost of putting development up. So let's have a realistic conversation about that. I'm concerned also in terms of the time that it would take to bring all these sweeping changes in, and that the sort of timescales that are being suggested are really unrealistic. I know that involving pesky local people does take time, but you know what, pesky local people, it's their homes. And whilst we all at times, you know, our hearts sink when you go out on a new consultation of the local plan and you see the usual suspects lined up. Those people care, and they have a right to be involved in their community and their built environment. And whilst this local white paper makes these, you know, great statements that the communities will be more involved because they've got a smartphone apparently, I don't see it working that way. Local community engagement, no matter how much you digitalise it, takes hard work and face-to-face meetings with people and planners, going out and talking to them in the streets, in the supermarket, in schools. That's how you do it. Yes, digitalisation could well help. It's not a panacea. It's about face-to-face discussion and contact and talking and making those relationships with residents' associations. So I can see if you're going to throw out a whole system, you're going to have to bring communities with you. I don't see the resources there to do that. And at the same time, we've got to completely change the way we've done planning. And I don't think that's at all in a positive way. So a few other things, what I want to say about it, design codes. I mean, I just find it laughable that design codes are being seen as a panacea for solving the problem, and that suddenly we're going to have beautiful houses everywhere because we design code it in. Design codes are a useful tool. They are certainly not a panacea, and writing design codes takes time. And my concern is as I said, we're not in Australia or America. We don't have, you know, straightforward square plots of land which are all neat and tidy. We have uncomfortable wonky edges, we have uncomfortable surrounding development, we've got topography, for goodness sake. So these are all issues that are very difficult to design code in. And by the way, biodiversity doesn't work, you know, with, you know, design codes. How are you going to design code biodiversity? So you've got all these complex issues that need to be considered through, and design codes are not the answer whatsoever. And I think also going to a rules-based system is undermining the whole planning system totally. And that one of the things we really excel in the UK, as I said, in terms of our built environment, is having a system that is shades of grey, that provides flexibility, that really responds to the local vernacular and to an environment and context that has been created over thousands of years. And let's not lose that, and let's remember that that's what we should be protecting.
Thank you, Heather. That was really interesting to get your take on design codes. I hadn't even really thought about what would happen with biodiversity and design codes. I think you're right. I think that's a really, really important point, how it's all going to knit together. The design codes are being used a bit as a panacea. Finally, over to Sara. Thanks again for joining us, Sara. So my question for you really is that the white paper heavily focuses on community engagement, and Heather touched on it briefly in her answer. You know, it talks about digitally focused, it talks about having local people involved in creating design codes, and an even larger role possibly for neighbourhood planning. And we don't know what's going to come out in relation to that with the devolution white paper as well, which is expected soon. But what do you think the main challenges will be for local authorities in this, and especially coming from a non-London context as well?
Thanks, and thanks for having me. So Heather, I agree with everything you say in terms of the main thing that I get from communities is if infrastructure and that kind of engagement with developers really, really helps to be able to bring a community along and get them to a level of understanding of what the application of what the proposal is looking at. And this idea in the planning white paper is moving everything back to the plan making stage, which, let's be honest, in terms of every 5 years or every 7 years, when you're going to be looking at all your big sites and allocating them, that's going to be their main chance to get involved. Because when the planning application comes along, it's going to be a lot less engagement. It's really kind of front-ended at this front end. So I'm not convinced that, I mean, the ambition is great in the planning white paper for the digital technology. Absolutely fantastic. I manage a development management team. If we can have machine readable location plans and machine readable policies, you know, that's a big game changer. It feels like that's more of a 10-year position to put us in, a 10-year plan rather than a kind of 2-year kind of position that we might get to. But if you've got the opportunity for engagement at that local plan making stage, the digital enhancements to consultation are going to have to be dramatic to be able to get people on board. And I think there's a real kind of disconnect between what's happening at the central government ideas and policies and what's really happening at the kind of local level in terms of parish and town councils or locally elected members. So I think in terms of going forward, the increase in digital technology is really aiming to increase with people's smartphones and young people, and it'd be fantastic to include young people in engagement, but I'm not sure that that is going to overcome the objections. I'm not sure that is going to make more house building, you know, better quality, etc., etc. I think it is going to take a long time to be able to upskill everybody in a way in the community. So it's not so much just about resources and a local authority. I know now for my plan over the next kind of 2 years that I need to get officers into a position where they've got community engagement in a different way, you know, via digital technology, that we've got different kind of pieces to be able to put into our kind of suite of technology. But that costs a lot of money and it takes a lot of time to embed them in and integrate them with our, you know, boring things like public access and uniform and various other things. And it's knowing that those resources are going to take a while to upskill with design codes for officers in house, with the community engagement, with the biodiversity coming forward, with climate change. But we also need to upskill our communities. You know, they need to be brought along on that journey as well, because otherwise, if they're objecting to an application and are seeing something with not a positive position, they're not going to be able to let go of that and then engage all of a sudden in a design code. And the planning white paper is very clear on saying design codes need to have that community engagement matter to really have weight. And I think that that's a real challenge for a community, because if they're in a position where they're against something, they need to understand, you know, further around, you know, how is it really going to work? Where's the infrastructure going to come online? When is it going to come online? You know, why has it been allocated, et cetera, et cetera. It's just being able to know that they can't just leave all that behind and any concerns and go straight into kind of looking at a design code. I think there's a lot of opportunities. I mean, removing site notices and press notices, a lot of people do rely on them, but I think we can definitely be moving forward, and we do need to move forward. We do need to kind of, I agree with Neeru, we do need to kind of get the planning system kind of a bit more open to these kind of technologies. And I think COVID-19 has been a brilliant example, and is noted in the planning white paper that planners and local authorities have done a great job at diversifying and kind of really adapting to the situation. And I think the communities as well have really integrated themselves with more Facebook groups and WhatsApp groups, etc. So we can tap into all of that and really kind of harness that kind of community gatherings. But there are a lot of drawbacks. I really kind of feel that, you know, we always have concerns in local government around kind of, you know, would people be disconnected if we're just doing everything digitally online? And, you know, parish and town councils in my area went digital, so we stopped printing plans about 3 years ago. Every now and again you might get a comment. So, you know, I don't think they're quite ready for this, and it's been able to kind of really kind of help them with that. But I think in terms of the design codes, these could have real unintended consequences, and I know Heather touched on it. You can put too much detail into a design code, and I think if the community's involved, there could be a risk of that, and that could really have an impact onto the developer in terms of the speed of being able to deliver. I think in terms of getting the community involved, it's everything I just mentioned about, you know, really kind of upskilling officers to kind of facilitate that and upskilling the community. But I think also in terms of, if the planning white paper is saying that design codes should pick up on the things that the communities like in an area, is there a risk that we're going to get quite a lot of pastiche development? And will that have an unintended consequence onto modern architecture? You know, those kind of one-off homes, etc. How are they going to sit in an area that we would normally be very kind of supportive of? But if you have a design code that's a bit more restrictive, that's going to be a real kind of consideration. And I think in terms of, will it have more homes, better quality, you know, faster? I'm not convinced at all. And I think really it goes back to the point that from my experience, communities, once they know that infrastructure is going to be included, once they know it's going to be included at the right point, they then become more open to the fact of, yes, they're going to have the schools, the roads, the buses, the cycle lanes, or the cycle parking, etc., that they've got that really helps communities be able to kind of get online with an application. So I think that would help more in terms of more homes. So I think it's been able to see how that kind of comes through. I think in terms of the design, I think it's more around the maintenance as well that we have a real issue with, the maintenance of buildings, the maintenance of open spaces, that kind of stewardship question, which is really hard to tackle. Will the local authority adopt the open space in however many years, and how much will that cost? And is that in the Section 106, etc.? And if it doesn't happen, how does it get maintained? Because quite often you can have a development and 5 or 6 years later, it doesn't look that welcoming. The render needs maintaining, the open spaces are very bland, etc. They've not got anything exciting in them. It's really kind of been able to improve those kind of situations, which is on us as a local authority as well as the developers in terms of the management companies coming forward. In terms of building it faster, I think we've got to remember that this planning white paper does not change the house building industry. It does not change that business model. It does not change the shareholders, and the Letwin review confirmed that house builders would not flood the market. So I think the economy really does ride on the development industry, and planning is a massively important part of that. But if you want to start a business, any business, you need to borrow money. Banks like you to borrow money against an asset, which might be land, and if the land value increases, I think we need to kind of understand that that is part of the economy. So this planning white paper will still have that, context, if you like. So I think there is another consultation out at the moment, which is an interesting one on the transparency of that land valuing. And so I think, the government are aware of this, but it's really been able to kind of see it in the context of a wider reality. But I'd like to be, positive about the positives. I'd love to have a digital, enhanced development management system. I think it would cost a fair bit, and I think it should be set out nationally so that everybody doesn't have to procure 360 odd different pieces of software and get them embedded into their own systems. And I completely agree with Heather about the community. I don't think digital is going to bring them along. I think it requires the kind of same skill set that we're currently doing, but maybe in a more modern kind of a way. But we still need that engagement. Thanks.
Thank you, Sara. That was really, really interesting. So before we come back to some of the questions that everybody's been putting on the Q&A, thank you very much for those so far. I think it'd just be really interesting to just for the panelists to think about anything else that they wanted to say about the white paper from their own personal view, but also possibly how they think it's going to affect their specific council. So Neeru, was there anything else that you wanted to add to what you said earlier?
Thanks, Charlotte. I think in terms of my work with Barnet, obviously over the past couple of weeks, I've had politicians and senior officers asking me about the implications of the white paper. And equally, some of the local authorities my team support nationally are also being asked this question. And my advice has been, so far as we start to see it unravel, is to press on with the current system. Many authorities have put so much resource, time and money into getting their plans progressing through the system that it just seems that it would be a wasted opportunity not to actually work with the evidence base you've provided and put together, not to continue with the intensive consultation stages you've gone through and the due diligence you've done on duty to cooperate, whether you like it or not, to not move forward and provide a spatial framework doesn't feel like an option. And I think especially now when we need more certainty, not less. So I think there will be a temptation by some authorities and some politicians to think about pressing pause. But I certainly don't think that's the right and positive move for councils to go down. So it's not something I'd be advocating. It's not right for councils, and it's certainly not right for those communities that have been engaged. And it doesn't feel like the government wants us to stop planning. That's the last thing it wants us to do. But it needs to actually move forward with giving us some more detail. And we can't simply just down our tools. The pandemic has taught us so much that we must actually be moving forward to provide that positive framework. So yeah, I think in terms of what I would just add is that, this isn't, like Heather says, the panacea. It is going to take time to come through legislative changes. And in the meantime, we've got a job to do.
Thank you. Yeah, I definitely agree. It's not a time to down tools, and people should keep progressing. And I think the point you made about actually those people, those communities that we've all engaged with in that process, you know, it's doing them a bit of a disservice to just stop. So Lucy, was there anything you wanted to add to what you said earlier?
Thanks, Charlotte. I suppose just to reiterate really that for me, you know, probably the most important thing right now, as we're hopefully moving out of lockdown, is about recovery, and that's what the planning system needs to be really, really focused on, helping local authorities and helping the country to deliver. And I think you know, the idea that the government wants to sort of fundamentally restructure the planning system at this time kind of flies in the face of what we actually need, is that rapid delivery of development, and it feels like we kind of can't do both because we haven't got enough focus and bandwidth to do that. You know, trying to dismantle that planning legislation over the last 70 years at the same time as coming out of a COVID-19 pandemic and recovering from that, it just feels a bit mad, really. So I think that's one of the things that certainly we've been talking about in Ealing, is how we respond to this white paper, talking about our track record of delivery. And I think most other London boroughs can do the same, because we've got a fantastic track record of delivery in London. And really saying that actually, come on, let's look at what the planning system has already delivered. You know, you don't need to chuck everything out and start again, particularly at this particular time. So definitely our response is going to be focused on that. And then the other thing I wanted to say just about consultation is, you know, I completely agree with what Heather and others have said, that the idea that you can sort of shut local people out and you can only engage with them once every 5 years is complete nonsense. And what we are hoping we're going to be able to do is to use this as an opportunity to actually get closer to our local people, because this is something that we can align with those who are really interested in planning, and perhaps are often usually our usual suspects. But this is something that we are in complete agreement with those people on, is that consultation is something that needs to happen throughout the planning process and all the time. And we want to get better at it and do more at it. We've seen the response of our communities during COVID, and we want to get closer to those. So I think we're going to also be using this as an opportunity to have further discussion with our local people on what the response to this white paper might be, and that's definitely one thing that we can have a shared view about. So in some ways I think that's helpful.
No, that's really, really interesting. I think community engagement is definitely coming up as one of the main issues with the white paper, which is ironic considering it's probably one of the words mentioned the most in the white paper and seems to be something that they've focused on, but we can obviously see quite a lot of holes in what's proposed. Heather, was there anything that you wanted to add to what you said earlier?
Lucy, I mean, you put it so very well. You know, London has got a great track record of delivery. And I think it's interesting to think that there's London and the rest of the country. And I think London has got a great track record, partly, I think, or quite importantly, because we actually have a regional plan in place. We've got the London plan that clearly sets out housing targets. So we're not bitching about what our housing number is, we just get on with it. And I think that's what really any sort of looking at the planning system ought to do, is to go back and put in place regional planning, because I think that is a really important missing tier that should be put back in and would help speed up planning, quite frankly, and deliver proper strategic spatial planning. I think the other thing the government kind of ignores in all this, although it seeks to do it by centralising planning, is to cut out, you know, local politics and the role that plays in slowing things down. So it's all very well saying, oh, it's planners, you haven't got the skill set, you're slowing things down because you can't get on with it. But actually, a lot of it is down, as we all know, to what the political will is in a particular authority. Now in Croydon, we're very lucky, we've got a very sort of pro-development authority who wants to get on and build. And I think there's a lot of places in London, a lot of boroughs in London that do that. However, in the shires, it is a bit different. And that is what the government really needs to deal with, instead of continually throwing the planning system up in the air and trying to change it, or to tear it up, as Boris is now saying. And as Lucy says, we've got to get on the road to recovery. The last thing we need is to throw it all up in the air and to totally reinvent the system, whilst we've got no local resources. And they have been, you know, local government has been massively hit by COVID, and you know, we've lost income, and we've had to spend vast quantities of money in terms of the response. And you know, local councils are reeling from that. How on earth are we going to resource all this? Is the government suddenly going to come around and say, actually, here's several million quid to go and buy all this new digital kit, and also to upskill all these planners, and to provide all these planners to rewrite these, you know, design codes, you know, and because that's effectively putting the onus on to local councils to actually plan in quite minute detail the sort of stuff that actually comes in through a planning application. So it's kind of switching the emphasis from the developer putting the resources in to local councils doing it. So just to wrap up on it, the other points I wanted to make was that what the government should really be doing, bearing in mind that there are plenty of local planning authorities who are doing a good job, is to come and talk to those local authorities who are actually delivering housing, and there's plenty of examples around the table here and actually through the rest of England who are doing it really well, and to talk to people who actually run planning departments, because I'm frankly quite hacked off with papers coming out that have not been written with any informed understanding of how local planning works in reality. So that's what they should be doing, not just pick and mix of people who've never actually had to sit down and think, I've got a bunch of politicians, I've got a bunch of developers here, and I've got a bunch of community. How am I going to, you know, sort this all out? And that's what local planning departments do every day of the week, and they do it largely very well with very poor resources. So government, come and talk to local planning departments before you start changing things.
Yeah, here, I agree with that. I definitely think they should be coming around and speaking to everybody that's actually involved in the system, that's at the coalface.
Yeah, we're part of the solution, not the problem.
Exactly, no, very well said. Sara, did you have any additional comments based on what you said before, or anything else you wanted to say?
Yes, yeah, I think, in my opinion, being outside of London as well, the devolution bill in September is going to be a massive impact and should be seen with this, because I think what's coming down the line is, you know, quite a fundamental restructuring of local government, and the possibility of really encouraging it in areas. Then seen in line with this planning white paper, which is a very fundamental shift away from that kind of community engagement and, you know, a more centralised position and more centralised rules from government, etc., from permitted development. And I think those two together, it really does raise a question around, you know, the real kind of position of elected members. And I think that could fundamentally change over the next kind of year, 2 years, to be able to see how these kind of two pieces of, or two kind of white papers, etc., kind of really transform themselves into legislation, because that's, devolution bill will have a massive impact. So it's really kind of seeing those two in pieces. And, you know, how would I feel now if I was a locally elected member, knowing that these were kind of coming down the line? And I think the other thing it really highlights to me, and kind of anticipating that and reading this planning white paper, is the role for parish and town. I see those as really being kind of elevated, whether it's through the devolution kind of proposals or through these kind of proposals, in terms of they've got a massive responsibility in their roles. And yes, they do in any case now, but it's really kind of putting quite a lot of onus onto them. And if the community's not going to engage, well, then you do your design code in these kind of areas. So I think that's, as I said before, a little bit of an unfair position, because it's great to have them there, but that means that they need to be in that positive, engaging mode. If they're in that I've got questions mode, you know, how does that kind of sit in with the new kind of proposals? So I think it's a real kind of consideration of what happens in September, and seeing that in light with this is a kind of real area for me. And particularly, you know, in the fact that we don't have the regional planners kind of London and or anything else, the planning white paper misses that joint strategic plan making, and that's the kind of replacement for that. So it's really kind of been able to understand why that's missing. You know, we're still going ahead with ours, etc. They have had a very rocky road across the country. So I think that needs to be really kind of considered and played into responses as well. I mean, we've mentioned the upskilling point quite a few times, but I think POS and Planning Officer Society have done a paper called DM 4.0, which is quite a very interesting proposal, which was very much around kind of thinking how we can deal with all these digital kind of ideas around, if you do have a kind of a particular house type and you always know that a closet wing extension is going to be a good idea, or a 2-story extension is going to be a good idea, you can have your digital plans, and then you can actually, it would tick green that you're in the right zones, or it would go red if your extension gets too big, and then you can pull it back in, and then you can even print off your own kind of planning permission. That kind of an idea is a positive, and if you can kind of make that work, it's so much investment. But it's just being able to know that, you know, those kind of ideas are there, but it's really kind of rare to have that happening in 360 odd authorities going across the country. And it really means that you need that really good residential design code guide, so that you know your house types, you've done all your thinking about it, and you've got that kind of upfront. We don't have one at the moment. Dacorum are commissioning one. I know that Croydon's got a really good one that we've looked at, and various others around the country. But the other thing about resources, and the point's really well made, that everybody's had suffered in terms of income and costs, and more costs going forward in terms of our recovery plan. We're putting bids in for new, you know, economic development officers. You know, those costs aren't going to go away anytime soon. But it's also these refunds for planning applications. So if you don't deal with them in 8 and 13 weeks, then you have to return your fees possibly. You know, that's going to be incredibly hard to manage. So I think there's a big disconnect there as well. And it's that point about kind of talking to local authorities. I was on a call with CLG and I said, actually, I'm doing my budget setting for next financial year now. And he was like, that's a really helpful reminder. Thank you. Because I'd kind of forgotten that happens, you know, this early, and, you know, when it happens. And, you know, I know that I'm going to need further expertise in biodiversity or design, urban design, etc. And it's been able to plan for that. But if I'm planning for that and putting in any growth bids, and then knowing that I'm living in a year of potentially refunding my income for some applications, it's what unintended consequences that is going to have in terms of the developers. And, you know, they like an extension of time quite often. They like to be able to work through things at a pace, you know, with the local authority. So where will that sit? So I think from my particular area, it's very much seen around what happens in the devolution white paper coming out in September, because I think that will have a fundamental change to local government, which will impact on this as well. And then I think it is very much around that kind of disconnect between what's happening at the government level and what's happening at the local authority and local elected members kind of a level, as well as kind of everything that everybody else has mentioned. In the particular one as well, there's quite a few little changes in there that I don't think will really have much an impact, but I'm just picking up on the other consultation that's out as well, which has got the PIP, the Planning Permission Principle, is now going to be allowed for major applications as well as minor applications. They've not had a massive take up nationally, and I wonder whether they will now that they've got, you know, the possibility for a major. But that's dealing with a major within 5 weeks and 14 days worth of consultation. And I think that will come around quite quickly ahead of all the bigger legislative changes coming out for the planning white paper. So there's so much to pick up on in all the various, I think there's 4 or 5 different kind of consultations out at once. And we haven't really touched on affordable housing today and the first homes ideas, but there's a whole conversation there as well. Thank you.
No, thank you. Yeah, I think there is so much, and it is one of 3 papers that, you know, people don't forget that there's a lot to respond to in October. It won't be a quiet September for anybody. We've had quite a lot of questions come forward on the Q&A. We won't be able to go through all of them, but I think Daniel Partridge picked up on something that I've certainly been thinking about, and I'd welcome the panel's view on this, perhaps starting with Lucy. Section 106 also pays for employment and training initiatives and delivers resources for economic development, such as affordable workspace. How do we think these are going to be replaced under the new regime? You know, that's sort of what I was hinting at with some of the stuff I was trying to say in my question, is that it's so focused on affordable housing and the delivery of infrastructure that they forgot that, especially in London, actually, we use Section 106 for so much more. You know, are you starting to think about those consequences that might come out of the white paper, Lucy?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's you're absolutely right. We use that for many different things, and I think in Ealing we're actually, I think, the only London borough that hasn't yet introduced community infrastructure levy. So we're still dealing totally with Section 106, and that's because we've always welcomed, and for politicians particularly, welcome the flexibility around Section 106 as opposed to the community infrastructure levy and it all being capital money. So, I mean, I haven't seen any detail in the white paper about what we are and aren't going to be able to use this so-called slightly more simplified infrastructure funding for. But I definitely think that's something that you know, a borough like Ealing is going to be lobbying the government to say you've got to recognise that's what we use, and it's really important infrastructure for our communities. And I absolutely think that the flexibility that the local you know, local knowledge enables us to bring is, in terms of that decision making about what the infrastructure is that's needed, is going to need to be retained in some way. I think it will be really important to do that, and I think yeah, so my summary would be, we need to make sure that the government understands what the totality of infrastructure means to boroughs and to the community in terms of what we fund. The variety of things that we fund out of that infrastructure money is going to be, you know, I think we should all be responding to make the government aware of that.
I agree. It feels like a very big omission from that summary on the infrastructure levy. But Heather, Neeru or Sara, did you have anything to add on that particular point?
Yeah, I'd just like to say, I mean, I think we've had a community infrastructure levy in place, and we're updating it now with our local plan. And as Lucy said, it's about the flexibility. You know, you can play off Section 106 affordable housing and community infrastructure levy, and you make sure that you don't, you know, if you want to deliver affordable housing, and that's important, you don't set too high a sill level. So I would be very concerned about going in and trying to simplify it, and that it's all set, again, the centralisation by national government, without understanding what are the actual economic situation in each area. I mean, London Borough of Croydon has got a very different market to central Westminster, and that's in London. So how on earth, you know, is the government going to get it right compared, you know, Croydon to Westminster, to Dudley, to Berwick-on-Tweed, you know, all over the country? It's very different. So I think it's important that it isn't centralised, and I think sills, you know, personally, I think it's a great thing to have, but at the end of the day, it is, I think, down to local authorities, and it should be down to local authorities where they put their particular emphasis. Like Lucy said, you know, they want to get the flexibility, and each borough and each district is very, very different. And I think that's what government is failing to grasp, or does grasp, but doesn't want to, you know, work with it. The thing about the UK is we're very, very different all over the place, and we should be left with that flexibility. And they've mucked around with the sill regs quite a lot, and people now understand it and got their heads around it, and actually it works quite well, and it works also very well with Section 106, I think, as well.
No, I think that, yeah, I agree with you. And Neeru, did you have anything else to add on that?
I was just going to add that the flexibility is one thing, but it's also setting those local priorities, and not being able to do that is, you know, not going to be able to allow authorities to front load that infrastructure that's needed. And I think there's a real danger there that we won't be able to do what many in our communities are asking, which is, well, fine, let's have growth, but can we have the front loading of the infrastructure and set the priorities at that local level? So I think that is an issue that we're going to come up against with a centralised system.
Yeah, I agree. It does talk about local spending, but you just wonder what is actually going to be within the list of infrastructure that they allow us to spend it on. Sara, did you have any final points on that question?
Yeah, I think it's very much linked into the recovery plan as well, because at Dacorum we have our own kind of Maylands Business Centre, which the council own and run and have their own tenants kind of coming in and out, etc. So it's kind of seeing the lack of Section 106 income coming in, although we don't get that much, I must admit, not as much as what London boroughs would, but it's just knowing that it's then something that we already provide. So it's quite likely to, you know, we need to maintain it as a priority, or it's quite likely to kind of be hit. But we're seeing a massive increase in our residents being on universal credit. So there's a huge wave of kind of unemployment. So it's really been able to support the businesses. And my colleague, Chris Taylor, is fantastic at doing it, being able to say, you know, we need those kind of courses going on, that kind of softer support in our business centres, as well as just being able to provide that kind of small spaces, because the businesses have gone through such a tough time. And I think if you are an individual business owner and you know that you haven't been paid since March, or you're really kind of trying to keep it on at the, you know, nth degree, it's that kind of consideration that a local authority takes on, and we take on that responsibility and that role, which is outside of planning and is outside of Section 106 items, but is well likely to get a hit as well. So if you take a reduction in service around there, as well as what's coming through SIL and Section 106, we could be in a very tricky position in terms of local employment and local businesses and those small and medium enterprise businesses, which the government won't want. That's an unintended consequence that I don't think they've quite connected.
Yeah, I agree with you, and it sort of throws back to the fact that the white paper is so focused on housing that it's forgot that there are other things out there that we need to consider, and that local government does has a role to play in economic recovery and economic development, and Section 106 is part of that sometimes. We are probably running out of time for questions at the moment. I'll see if we've got time for just one more. There's one that keeps popping up on the Q&A through many different guises. Andrew Taylor and Mike Kiley, who we probably all know, have asked about what we think about the centralisation of development management policies in the white paper. Do we think that loses local flavour, as Andrew Taylor put it, or as Mike Kiley said, is it getting rid of unwelcome repetition? And yes, I'd welcome your views on that. Perhaps Sara, as the head of DM here.
I welcome it. So, I mean, I might be eating my words in the future, because I can see the value in it. Let me put it that way. So it's not that I welcome it so much wholeheartedly. The main nervousness is they have to be good. You know, a set of national policies, if they are good and they cover it well, then I can't see that it's going to, you know, do a massive kind of disfavour to local authorities. We do use the NPPF, we use the NPPG very well, and I think it's just knowing that I can take the point that there are, you know, however many, 350 odd design policies, and we're all intending to do the same thing, whether we're preserving and enhancing in conservation areas, etc. Same again with, you know, climate change may well change in different areas, but it's just being able to know that from a applicant's point of view, I can really understand that if you submit an application in Dacorum or in St Albans or in somewhere else, then you get a different kind of response. So yeah. I do understand that from that point of view, and I do understand as well that it may be then the layer below that really hold the importance. So that's supplementary planning and design guides. So in Dacorum, we're very much looking at climate change, SPD, we need our residential design guides. That's where I think that real local element can kind of come through. But I think I don't want to wholeheartedly welcome it. It's very much in the detail, the devil will be in the detail on that. Yeah, no, thank you very much. And we haven't got time for anything else at the moment. We've got 1 minute to go, but thank you to our panellists for joining us. It's been really, really interesting actually to get the local authority view on this and to get a planner's view on the white paper. As we said, we've got another session this Thursday with Mike Kiley, who asked one of the questions, and Montague Evans. So if you want to book your place onto that, it's at www.thevoiceofauthority.co.uk. We will try and deal with some of your unanswered questions and post them up on social media if our panellists are happy to do so. So do look out for that. And I just want to say a huge thank you to 3Fox and the Voice of Authority for allowing us to have this discussion and allowing Women in Planning to take over and give a platform for our wonderful speakers. But meanwhile, thank you very much from me, and thank you very much from our panellists. Have a good day, and we hope to see you soon. Bye.